Hello! I am the protagonist, also known as Our Brave Hero on other social media. And today is Tutorial Tuesdays. So about once a month, well, now once a month. It was a little more often. Now I'm going to do it once a month. We'll see how it goes. I pick a topic and I'll talk about it for a little bit on stream. And today it's frame rates and why they matter. And that is for animation specifically. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about like video game stuff because it is still animation. Um, but it's for the most part, it's like digital animation and whatnot. So, yeah, so thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Class is in session. But yeah, so hello. Um, so I guess I should be doing like a little bit of background stuff when I get into some of these, in case it's like a person's first time watching one of these, whether it's on stream or on YouTube later. Which to YouTube viewers, hello. Um, Basically, I am a freelance animator. I do mostly motion graphics work, but I do a little bit of character animation here and there. Um, I also do a lot of illustration work. So I figured since I have roughly a decade of experience in some of this stuff, it would make sense for me to just kind of to encourage other people to get more into it, and even for people that are into animation and stuff already. Some people might not know certain things about it, or even illustrators. Some people might not know some like certain basic things that might seem obvious, but it's not. Like, for example, um, certain things with proportions. I actually did a tutorial Tuesdays on proportions last time, um, where I talked about human proportions and different rules with that. So if you haven't seen that, go check it out. The VOD is probably still on my Twitch. Otherwise, there's an edited version up on my YouTube. My YouTube username is Our Brave Hero, all one word. So yes, thank you for coming. I have a couple of things to talk about with this. And also, this is not my entire stream is not going to be this. It is going to be well, for people on YouTube, it is going to be this. Haha. This will probably only be like around an hour. Obviously, it depends on the amount of questions I get. If people come in, people are more than welcome to ask anything they want. Sorry. I want to make sure my mic is good. Um, but yeah, so if anybody has questions while I'm going through this, in terms of animation or anything like that, feel free to ask a question. Um, Especially because if there are questions that get asked that could be a whole other stream, if it's something that'll take me a really long time to get into, I'll make a note of it so I know to go back to it later in like maybe next month's stream or something like that. I will go through. And yeah. Um, so basically, frame rates. The best way to explain that is the amount of images seen within a certain amount of time. So when you see something that's FPS, that's frames per second, which is a frame rate. So when you see people talk about video games running at 60 FPS or 120 FPS or whatever, that is how many frames per second a person is seeing. And when it comes to frames, there's a bunch of different frame rates that are used in like TV and animation and video games and stuff like that. But the most common ones you will see frame rate wise are 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. So what I'm going to do here is I actually have After Effects open. Actually, you know what? I also have something else, but I'm going to just X out of that real quick. Bop. Okay. I have After Effects open right here, and I'm going to swap these around. Boom. What? Okay. Sorry. So, um, I actually did a little bit of homework in advance, and I set up three different compositions in After Effects for just kind of like basically talking about this and maybe like kind of showing the difference. I believe Twitch actually records things at 60 FPS. So this should all look right. It might depend on what quality you are watching it in. So also on YouTube, I know YouTube has, if you have HD, um, it'll give you like, 1080p, 60 FPS or whatever like that. Um, so everything I'm showing here should, you should be able to see the differences. If for any reason you're not, uh, for however Twitch is working, if there's some reason stuff stopped playing back at the proper frame rate, I apologize. Um, in which case, when I upload this next week to YouTube, then that will be in 60 FPS because it will be, Twitch records it at that 60. So everything should look right on YouTube. So apologies if it doesn't have noticeable differences on Twitch. But doing the best I can with what we're working with. Frame rate. Let's talk about let's start first off with the 24. So I have three different colors here, also to show the different rates. So for 24 frames per second, that is basically the standard for television. So basically, any cartoons you see and stuff like that are usually at 24 frames per second because that's what most televisions up until semi recently could process. So even things that were running at over that might not have really been able to pick it up as much. But 24 frames per second means that there are literally 24 images every 60 seconds. So basically, say you're watching, let's see, say you're watching, oh, you know what? I actually have an example for this, which would be perfect. So say you're watching a Saturday morning cartoon and you get, we're watching Chowder. We'll pull up Chowder. So Chowder, and most Cartoon Network cartoons are that they run at 24 frames per second. So you will see, sorry, just grabbing this scene here, 24 frames per second, and you might hear the term animating in twos. Sometimes when you hear people talking about cartoons, and what animating in twos means is that it's technically 12 frames per second, but it's basically 2 frames of each drawing. So you'll get something like, one moment here. So you'll get something like, okay. This might all of a sudden play audio. Okay. So I'm gonna pull this up real quick on here. Bop. Aha, there it is. Okay. So, yes, 24 frames per second. Let's watch Chowder, 24 frames per second. Okay, so at 24 frames per second, in some cases, it's 12 frames per second. And the way you can basically tell that is if you go, so basically the faster something moves on the screen, the more, or rather the less frames it takes up. So if you have something that's like very sturdy, so this is, so you have, see, okay, so you have a couple things here where you have a few frames here where she's not moving at all. So that's when you have stuff where it's animating in twos. And when you animate in twos, that's basically to have a more basic movement on the screen. So you're not trying to fill up the whole second with a whole lot of movement, which is basically like more of a budget thing, and it's more less work for the animators, obviously, because instead of drawing 24 drawings for every uh, for every second, it's 12 drawings for every second. So when you have a show like Chowder that's like 22 minutes long, 24 minutes long, you start getting into, well, how many drawings do we need to do for this entire show that is almost half an hour long? And so if you get, when you get into like the 24 frames per second, that's kind of like, not only is it a technological limitation of older televisions and older broadcasting equipment, but it's also still technically used today in a lot of terms for like just budget purposes in general, not overworking some of the animated stuff like that. You will see some things that are animated at higher frame rates, but sometimes, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. First, I want to just give like a brief. I'll come back to Chowder in a second because I have, let's say, forced an animation into 60 frames per second to show kind of like a difference of what something looks like between the two. So I'll get back to that in a second. We're gonna hide this. Doom. So now we have a an animation here of a, we'll call it a ball rolling. I guess it could look like an eye, but so I have this ball animated in 24, 30, and 60. So in terms of the 24, and if for any reason anybody can't like notice the differences, apologies. Again, hopefully it'll show up properly on Twitch. If not, then unfortunately, might have to watch it again later on YouTube to get the full grasp of that. But so here we have the ball rolling. I have set a keyframe at that should be there. So this is 24. You can see here the halfway point is 12. So if we animate this at 24 frames per second, you know what? To make sure it works better, I will make this exactly 1 second long, because I didn't think of that in advance. So make this one exactly 1 second long. And while I'm doing this, so you will see most things kind of more nowadays in terms of like video games and stuff like that, especially with like newer consoles and everything. They all try to say that they try to lock at 60 frames per second. So the reasoning for the different types of frame rates is basically the higher the frame rate, the more you're seeing, the smoother the animation will look. So, for example, if you play something like Undertale and it's like, you're just seeing a sprite moving along the screen, that's might be moving at 60 frames per second or something, depending on whatever, but it's not necessarily being animated at that. But in terms of like, I don't really know a really good example for this one. Just basically any like 3D animated game that's supposed to look realistic and everything like that. 60 frames per second is basically what many people would consider the speed the human eye perceives things. The human eye can see at higher frame rates technically. It can technically perceive things that move faster in real life than what would be considered 60 frames per second. But usually if you like see movement of something in real life, your brain is kind of like perceiving it at 60 frames per second. You're seeing the equivalent of if you were to photograph everything you see over the course of a second. It would come out to roughly 60 frames per second. at least in terms of what you perceive. Obviously, there could be things that are like moving at microscopic levels and stuff like that. That would be like, yeah, I believe they said something about the human eye can perceive technically up to 1,000 frames per second, but in terms of what you can actually comprehend, it's usually 60. So there's an argument of if it's worth if it's worth getting animation in games and stuff like that up to 120 or something like that, because usually when you get over 60, then you don't notice excuse me, you don't notice the change as much once you bridge uh that 60 to whatever gap. So so here we'll talk about the differences a little bit and see if we can kind of show off the differences here just a little bit. So here at 24 frames per second, I will loop this. Okay, so here you can see, you see the movement, but it's a little. You know what? Let me full res that just to make sure it doesn't. Okay, so it's still there's like a little bit of a jitter. There's a little bit more of like a blur. Hopefully this isn't annoying anybody or making anybody weird. Okay, it stops when I do that. I was gonna say hopefully I can kind of go into OBS while it keeps going, but no, it automatically stops. So, but yeah, so you could basically see, and I could get like right into it. The movement here is, it's not, it's jumping. It's not. Even if I zoom in a little bit, you can really see you can see the dots here. There's just way less movement here. The black dot is kind of jumping around a little bit. It's like kind of forcing itself to go along the path technically faster because it has to get there in the same amount of time as a later one. So if we were to pop open 30, let's see what the difference is, what the difference in appearance is here. It'll be basically a little bit smoother. It won't be anything too crazy. And I just realized I don't believe I did not. Haha, but that's fine. So it's a little bit smoother. It still has a little bit of like jagged movement to it. The sides are still a little blurrier. But you could see with the way the black dot is moving that it's a little smoother. It's not as jumpy. And so basically, I mean, if you compare the dots, if you really want to get into comparing the dots, they are, is that 100, 100? Yeah. So obviously they are a little bit closer together because it is more frames of the movement, even though it's coming out to the exact same spot in the exact same amount of time, there's more images on the screen. So then obviously you get to 60. Let me make sure I fix this because when I animated this, I did it one frame off, but luckily it's, After Effects. That's why I did it in here. It's easier to fix. So on here, that it's so much smoother. So obviously going from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second you're literally doubling the amount of images. So you could just kind of see now if we zoom in on this, like how close together these are in comparison. Because yes, again, it is literally doubling the amount of images in the exact same amount of time. So basically, for layman's terms, that's frames per second. That's how you determine how smooth animation is. It's the more frames you have, the smoother it's going to be. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that 60 frames per second is automatically better. So I have seen a lot of, and I don't want to use them because technically it's other people's work, and I don't really want to use other people's work on this. But I would recommend just look up like anime interpolated at 60 frames per second. And I do have an example of this, of something I animated that I forced into 60. But if you go look at stuff that's interpolated into 60, it's it does some weird stuff. It forces more frames in there that didn't exist. Sometimes it'll just make the animation look really wonky. It'll do these really strange things, especially if you do like a fight scene. So let me real quick. I'll pull up VLC again here. But instead of regular Chowder, I'm going to pull up the Chowder reanimated shots that I did. So let me pull up the original one I did first. Okay. So this is at 24 frames per second. Oh, and now that's playing the other one. I guess it made a playlist there. That was unintentional. Haha. What is this? Click for loop. I didn't want to loop. Loop all, loop one. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, we'll look at this one again. So this is it at 24 frames per second. And then we pause it. So now I took this and I was like, well, what if I re-export this, since I made this in After Effects and it was easier to do it this way, if I force this at 60. And first off, you can see there's a little bit, but so as you can see, some of the movements are smoother and stuff like that, but it like forces this weird thing. It forces more frames in there that weren't there because it's interpolating what you did in a different way. So of course you could see it randomly forced in this weird twist frame that wasn't there, and then it, because it was basically interpolating the animation I did previously. So that's just like a good way for me to explain it, at least. Enter. Sorry, I accidentally clicked the wrong window. I was moving this over. So, and if we just watch the whole thing again, ignoring the little glitch there, so you can see the background. The background, everything's moving smoother. There's almost like a forced blur. If you look at it, the zoom in is like kind of faster and smoother feeling. And it's just because there's just so many more frames on it that it basically it just forces this smoothness that is unintentional. So a lot of people will try and do things with like anime and stuff like that where they'll be like, well, what will this fight look like at 60 frames per second? And then they'll basically put it through like an AI interpolation that will, the AI will basically force more frames into it. And you'll get like, it'll like look smoother, but it'll also look like unsettling almost. And people might remember, was it like The Hobbit or something that initially came out? It was this when one of those movies came out, and it was like this huge thing because it was like 60 frames per second, and like people were like, oh my gosh, it's going to be so much smoother, it's going to be whatever. And then a lot of people went and saw it, and they were like saying that they were getting headaches while they were watching it. It felt really awkward to them in general. It was something about it was bothering them. Some people got like motion sickness from it because there's this weird unintentional blur there, basically, that I'm just noticing that my thing got moved a little bit here. This unintentional blur that was like kind of really messing with some people. So basically, if something is not fully intended to be viewed at 60 frames per second, making it 60 frames per second is just going to make a lot of people think something is wrong. So if you do animate in 60 frames per second, first off, great, that's a lot more work for yourself. So if you want something to look a little smoother, personally I like animating at 30 because you do get more of that little bit of motion there. Especially if you're doing something like an action scene or something like that. The more frames you get in there, the better it'll look. But again, just because something has that higher frame rate doesn't mean it's going to necessarily look better, because you need to actually animate it for it. So, for example, I took just an old rough animation I did, and I'm gonna close out of this, and then look, it's bibbidi bop. Oh, gotta move this around a little bit because it came outside of the border. There we go. Okay, so let's look. I have a little animation of Froppy. Ha! So this one runs at 30. So again, I like personally animating at 30. And I'll just leave it looping while I'm talking. I like animating things at 30 because, like I said, it is a little bit smoother. And you can still animate in twos a little bit. So if you look down here on the timeline, I have a couple of, where are they? There it is. I have a couple of spots here where, like, say she has her eyes closed and she's thinking for like that. So when you want to add like a frame in that's like you want to hold a little bit of the motion for a second, you basically could do that. And I technically have I have her hand move like a tiny bit on a separate layer, like barely move at all. But yeah, so you could still animate in twos, but that way the regular like one frame of animation you get, it'll be a little bit smoother. You'll get a little more movement to it. Whereas if you were animating things at 24 frames per second, whether you're animating in twos or not, obviously a little bit less detail. Best way for me to explain animating, whether or not you should animate in twos, is how much movement you want on the screen. So let's say you have people, it's just a shot, maybe like this, of people walking and talking or something like that. You would want, basically you might as well do that in twos, unless somebody's mouth is moving extremely fast. There's not really any reason to necessarily do a new animation, like a new frame of mouth movement every single 1/24th of a second or 1/30th of a second or 1/60th of a second. You might as well animate stuff like that in twos if there's really not movement happening on the screen, or not dynamic movement. So going back to Chowder, we'll say that when let me pull this back up. So when I'm going to get out of my 60 frames per second of this scene and open this one back up, that is at 24. So for this, the way I have this animated is I have, every single frame here for the 24 FPS is some kind of movement happening on the screen, because I wanted, like, no matter what frame you pause it on, for there to be some kind of movement different in it. But if you look at other cartoons or something like that, you might, so like even though this is zooming, I have multiple frames here of him starting to talk. And so this is basically what would be animating it too. Is like I could basically get a couple of frames in here where it is still that, because it doesn't really need the it doesn't really need the extreme amount of dynamic movement for the mouth movements and everything like that. It's the same thing with like I could be animating his eyes blinking. Like I could have it start at the top and then have a couple of frames of it closing and then whatever. But I mean, or I could just, because it's moving at 24 frames per second, I could literally just jump here. But if I was doing like 60 frames per second and then it did this, it would almost be a little more jarring to just kind of go like this, because you would just be like, ah. It'd be like, it would seem like it was extremely fast. So definitely can just animate in twos for stuff like that. You don't need to have every single frame taken up basically by some kind of animation or something. But when you have a lot of movement you want to portray, so like when you actually, so like see if you have here, this is still, this is getting back into 24 frames per second, because I have like these 4 frames here where it's still moving the arm, and his hand is coming around and grabbing. But so say I have frame here, hand coming up, frame here, hand coming up, and then basically just the grab there, because again it's 24 frames per second, so you can have faster movements happening within the 2 frames, because you're not making up like that whole amount of time. So when you go into something that's like a 3D game or something like that, and you have something kind of like randomly happen on screen really fast, that isn't necessarily an extremely fast movement, it'll look weird. It'll literally look like imagine if you're looking at a person in real life and you just see somebody like trip and fall. As weird of an example as it is to use that, if you like see somebody trip and fall, if you like take every bit of that movement of the person falling as a frame, imagine seeing somebody fall and then like cutting the time they're falling, like cutting the amount of movement you see in them when they fall in half, or like if somebody is literally standing there and then you blink and then they're just on the ground and you don't actually even see the animation. So that's a good way to explain the difference in the frame rate. Is the more you want to see in something, the more frames you want to draw in it. So when you are working on something like an animated show, if something is 24 frames per second, you're going to want to cram as many frames of action into those 24 frames as possible when it comes to a dynamic movement, like if you're animating somebody falling or something. But if you want something to take longer to show, or you want you don't really want that much movement, like say you have a background character, and the background character is just kind of like, you have some kind of like idle animation for them standing in the background, but then somebody in the front like foreground rather, is moving across the screen, so you might animate them on separate layers and animate the person in the back in twos because they're not really moving, but animate the person in the front, say if there's like a fight scene going on in front, or just somebody running across the screen or something like that, you would animate them every single frame a different drawing, basically. So another thing is, a question some people might have is like, well, what if I just take an animation and convert it into 60? Won't that just, make it look smoother? And the answer to that is, no, not necessarily. Now, when you see a lot of that stuff, it's Again, it's like an AI interpolation. So if you go on and you look up like a Dragon Ball Z fight or something like that in on YouTube, and you look up Dragon Ball Z 60 frames per second or something like that, you'll see the forced stuff, and it uses an AI basically to force in new frames instead of actually making it. So like if you take a clip, and here's actually an example. If you just take an animation of something or just a video and force it at 60, let me grab Chowder again because I did this already. Sorry, just grabbing my proper clip here. So here's the regular 24 frames per second, and it okay, there it is. So I went, well, let's see what it looks like if I take the original and put it through a thing and I force it to 60. And what happens is it looks almost the same. It doesn't actually, you don't really notice a difference there, even though this is actually running at 60 now. So just forcing a video out at 60 is not going to change the frame rate. So again, as the example, when I bring out the actual clip I forced into 60, and you see that like weird smoothness and like some of the graphical glitches and everything like that. Oh, yeah. I'm realizing that I don't even have the desktop audio on, so that's fun. Boy, did I have that off that whole time? Well, I guess it wasn't really... the audio wasn't important for most of that anyway. But, so the point there being is the reason it works here on that clip is because I re-exported the animation and forced the program to add more frames in. So because it was like, yeah, it's a good way, a different way to explain it. I'll pull up this Froppy animation I have. So there's two different ways to take this animation and make this into a 60 frame per second animation. And one of them is, okay, well, what if I just add more frames? Will it actually look any smoother? And the answer is, if you draw more frames, sure. If you just add in more frames that don't have actual more movement to them, you get the same movement, because now it's 60 frames per second animating in twos. So it's 30 frames per second. So the other question about that would be like, well, what if you don't even add any more frames? What if you just force it into 60 frames per second? And what happens there is let me save this as a new file again. What happens there is stuff basically just speeds up. So save this as 60B. So here, sorry, let me get this. So here it is still 30 frames per second. There's 42 frames. So now if I go over here and I give me 1 second while I change the settings here. Change frame rate. So if we change this to 60 the way it is now, what's going to happen is, oh, it's much faster. That's literally just what'll happen. It'll cut the time in half. It'll force it 60 because you don't have any extra drawings on there. So there's really, unfortunately, not, especially when it comes to hand drawing, there's not like a shortcut to make things look smoother. There's not a shortcut to make things look like you did more drawing than you did. If you want something to be animated at a higher frame rate, you kind of have to actually put in the work. So technically, what I could do is I could make this animation into 60 and then go in and add some more keyframes in between certain things. And then, yes, it will look like smoother animation because you're forcing more keyframes in there. But if you just go into a video you already have, if you just export it again as a higher frame rate, it'll most likely not change anything. If it changes anything, it'll just basically make it kind of glitchy. So it behooves you to just animate things at the frame rate you intend it to be at. Because, like, say if I took a 24 frame per second animation and then exported it as a 30, if it even though it's like a even though it's not a bigger amount of frames that much, even though it's only 6 frames difference, it'll either look basically exactly the same, or when it tries to add in frames, sometimes you'll get these weird graphical glitches where it'll add in twos where you didn't plan on it. So if you had something that was supposed to be a much smoother animation because you had like 10 frames in a row, every single frame was a new drawing, and then you try to force 6 extra frames into that, it's going to make the speed look weirder. So in some cases, if you draw something and it doesn't look right, like the animation feels too fast, that's when you would go in and you would add a couple of extra like frames of the exact same drawing or something like that. But for the most part, you really want to animate at the frame rate you're planning on exporting it at. So we'll use the Chowder Reanimated again. That was at 24 frames per second. Now say somebody just animated a scene at 60 for that. What that might do is, if that got put into the whole thing and then the whole thing gets exported at 24 frames per second, the whole, final video, what that'll do is that'll either make your animation look weirdly choppy because it'll be only reading some of the frames, or it'll make your animation move way faster than you intended it to because it's trying to cram all of those frames into that chunk of time, and it'll just do some really weird stuff. So if you have a project with multiple people, you want to make sure you clear up in advance what kind of frame rate it's going to be at. Obviously, aspect ratio and everything like that is important too. But when you're doing anything with frame rate, just try to figure out the best frame rate for the project you're doing. So 60, you could do a drawing animation, a hand-drawn animation at 60 if you really want to include like a crazy amount of detail and fluid animation. But when you get into some of the other stuff, it's just going to be like, it's 24, at least if you're working for like TV or something, it's 24 is going to be like the standard. Sometimes it'll be 30. 30 is usually more for digital animation. So if you see like online animations and stuff like that, I think YouTube runs at 30 usually. A lot of digital online stuff runs at 30. So personally, that's what I like to do at. And then, if you're doing something for a video game or something like that, if you could get 60 frames per second, it'll look really smooth. If you're doing 3D animation, I don't have a lot of, I don't want to like try and get into a whole bunch of stuff of showing off 3D animation at 60. I'm for the most part not a 3D animator. I've done a little bit of it, but I'm not going to try and pretend I'm like an expert in terms of the 3D stuff. So any examples I would give that are 3D would be other people's work, which I try not to bring other people's work into stuff unless it's official examples from something. But even then, just as weird as it sounds to go onto a video and just have somebody tell you go look at another video, uh, that's the best way I could explain it, is to just go look up examples of things running at 60 that weren't initially animated at 60, or even tests for like consoles and stuff like that, where you could see like an older console. If we're talking about 3D animation, look at how a game runs on an older console versus how it runs on a newer console that runs at 60. So so definitely just like I said, plan it out in advance. When you're making any kind of animation, personally, again, I would say aim for 30. If it's going to be a project that's more like a collab project or something, and it's based off of something that was already based at 24, you could do 24. I mean, you could technically do 12. Again, if you want to do it in animate in twos, it'll be less work for you. You can animate in twos at 30 also, so it would be 15 frames per second, so it'll look a little better than the 12. Hopefully nothing I'm saying is confusing to anybody. Please, if I'm going too fast or anything like that, if you have any questions, please let me know. Toss it in the chat if there's anything I can explain better. But otherwise, that's for the most part. I think I basically got everything I wanted to get across. I'll just kind of go through a couple of things again, in case anybody is popping in towards the end here. Let me open up After Effects again. So just another quick demonstration of the differences here. We'll go through 24. So here, yeah, again at 24 frames per second, it's like a little choppy, but it's, it's still, you still see the movement. And the best time to use 24 frames per second, or when you're doing 24 frames per second, a lot of times it's better to do animation in twos if it's not like a whole lot of movement. So that would technically be 12 drawings per second. And then if it's more action oriented, if there's more movement on screen that you need to show more frames, then you would do a drawing for every 24 of the frames per second. And 60 frames per second is, the basically the standard in terms of human vision. So at 60 frames per second, that's when things are looking smooth, things are looking more realistic. They're looking basically the way your eye would perceive something moving in real life. So when you do 60 frames per second, sometimes it can be a little jarring because you're not used to seeing something on a screen that looks the same way it looks in real life. And the human eye usually perceives things differently depending on the frame rate. So 30 is usually what a lot of stuff digitally goes to. 30 is like kind of like a balance in between the two, because it's it looks smoother. It's what a lot more people are used to seeing things move at, but it's really up to whoever's animating. It's up to whoever's in charge of planning everything out. They might want something animated at a specific frame rate, and as an animator, you just kind of need to figure out the best approach to that, if you want to add in more frames or not to certain things. So yeah, I mean, if anybody has any questions, please let me know. I think I basically covered everything. But yeah, basically just in terms of why the frame rates matter, it really just depends on the medium you're using. So for 60 frames per second is definitely more of a video game standard, a 3D animation kind of thing. It makes things look more realistic because that's mostly what the human eye perceives things at. Would be 60. 24 is television standard. So most cartoons run at 24, and then 30 is basically how a lot of digital animation and stuff like that runs at. So usually stuff on YouTube or stuff like that you might see at like 30. A lot of games do run at 30. So games that you see that maybe that are not realistic games, if the movement in them doesn't seem particularly realistic, if it doesn't seem like ridiculously smooth or something like that, it's probably running at 30. I'm not entirely sure at what kind of games, if there are games out there that run at 24. I'm sure some people have them, have stuff like that running at 24 frames per second, but usually the standard for that is 30. And then just anything that's trying to be more realistic movement wise is usually at 60. You do get into some games that you'll get up to people trying to push 120 frames per second. And like you might notice a difference between 60 and 120, but you won't notice as much of a difference between 60 and 120 or whatever frame rate you push your computer to that you would between something like 24 and 60, because the eye only can perceive so much movement. So I think basically that's it. If anybody has any questions later on like the YouTube version of this, please leave comments or hit me up on Our Brave Hero on Twitter, or feel free to follow me on Twitch at The Protagonist, and just if you come into a stream there, you could always ask me. I'm always happy to answer questions during basically any of my streams. So I mean, if somebody watches this on YouTube and then comes into a stream that has nothing to do with this, I'll still talk about it. I'll still answer any questions. So feel free to hit me up literally whenever if you have questions about anything. I definitely recommend going and checking out my other two Tutorial Tuesdays that have been uploaded, which talks about storyboards and shot compositions and proportions in drawing. Those are both up on YouTube. That they have been edited down a little bit. The first one was like a 4+ hour stream because it was my first time doing a tutorial, and I was like, I'm gonna do as much information as possible, and I probably super overdid it. So now I'm basically just kind of doing shorter tutorials, trying to find a good balance. So let me know if you prefer it shorter like this. I am probably going to try and stick with the shorter ones like this. If it still seems like the hour-long video is too long for people or anything like that, I'll just start doing. I might not stream them specifically anymore. I might do like premieres on YouTube of like 20-minute snippets of tutorial stuff, and I'll just break them into like a bunch of different parts if it's a really in-depth topic. So like if I were to go through and break up like proportions into separate things, stuff like that, if I go back to it, I'll do like a 20-minute video specifically on head proportions, a 20-minute video specifically on body stuff, whatever. So so to YouTube people, I'm gonna cut it off here. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Outro, go!